Okay, good morning Year 9. If you hear a bell go off in the background, do not worry, it's just me cooking my dog's breakfast. Okay, so we have just finished off with Mr. Birling trying to make the inspector feel very, very nervous, or to try and push down his status when he talks about, oh, I didn't suppose you played golf. In that way, Mr. Birling is trying to seem quite haughty, quite upper class, and he's looking down on the inspector here because remember, golf was a very expensive sport, and also he's sort of pointing out to the inspector, you know, I didn't think that you would have played something like that because of your class. So again, he's trying to push himself above the inspector. Now, we then move on to Eric bursting out. Now, the stage directions are really important. You can remember a lot of them. They are very short quotations. They will help you a lot. Now, when Eric bursts out, that means he can't control his emotions anymore. Now, this is really interesting. This is the first part where it really foreshadows, make sure you're making this note, really foreshadows that actually Eric is, or Eric is rebellious, okay? So he is happy to rebel against his father. And that's what we need to consider here. The fact that he's happy to rebel, he's happy to go against his dad. So, then Eric, the inspector thinks he's talking about golf, but actually, Eric says, no, I mean about this girl, Eva Smith. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices, and I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she had a bit more spirit than the others. You said yourself she was a good worker. I'd have let her stay. So when we compare Mr. Birling and Eric, we kind of start to see who's more capitalist and who's more socialist. Now, the whole point of capitalism, or what capitalists say, is that if you work hard, you will get rewarded. Work hard, you get more money. Now, actually, what Priestley is pointing out here is that that is a complete and utter lie. He's pointing out that capitalism is a lie. It's not about how hard you work, it's about what class you're born into. Because clearly, Eva Smith worked incredibly hard, but she wasn't actually able to go any further. And she actually got sacked for it. Now, where we get our AO2 in here is where we talk about Priestley repeating the idea that she was a good worker. Now, there is repetition here. Mr. Birling says it, Mr. Birling says someone else said it, and Eric says it as well. So there's repetition. We're constantly telling the audience, make sure you've written this down, we're constantly telling the audience that Eva Smith is a good worker. So then the audience knows that actually getting sacked wasn't her fault. And we'll come back to that later on when we see what Sheila did to Eva Smith, because it's actually really interesting again that the idea is repeated. So Eric seems to be a much better employee, or would be a better employer than his father. But Mr. Birling then says rather angrily, and look at that adverb, angrily, that his son is challenging him, and Mr. Birling responds straight away with anger. Unless you brighten your ideas, you'll never be in a position to let anybody stay or to let anybody go. It's about time you learnt to face a few responsibilities. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had doesn't seem to teach you. Now, what's ironic here, and making sure you're writing this down, what's ironic is that he's talking about responsibilities. Now, he has a responsibility as an employer to pay fair wages, doesn't he? I mean, maybe not in 1912, but the audience watching 30 years later would think he does. So he talks about Eric not being a responsible person, but Eric seems to be quite fair. So there we have, again, Mr. Birling being a big hypocrite. So hypocrites will tell you not to do something and then they'll do it themselves. So that's where we see that Mr. Birling is a hypocrite. Eric then says sulkily, well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we? Now, he doesn't want him to tell the inspector all about his public school varsity lifestyle, because it basically means Eric went to a private school, had a lot of sort of laddie times, went to a lot of parties, did a lot of that sort of stuff, and Eric sort of is a bit ashamed of that, which is why he acts sulkily. Then Mr. Birling says, I don't see we need to tell the inspector anything more. Now, that's really interesting here because the inspector's the person who's meant to be doing the inquiry, but Mr. Birling's the one who decides when, it thinks he's the one who gets to decide when to end it. That's really interesting to me as well because it's again Mr. Birling trying to claw back power from the inspector. In fact, there's nothing I can tell him. I told the girl to clear out and she went. That's the last I heard of her. Have you any idea what happened? Have you any idea what happened to her after that? Get into trouble, go on the streets. Now, once again, he's repeating the fact that actually Mr. Birling is not a good person. Mr. Birling's very judgmental, and it's not because, but he knows the girl's a good worker. There we go. Dog's breakfast is ready. He knows the girl is a good worker. But actually what he's saying here is that did she get into trouble? So he's judging her on her class, he's not judging her on her personality. So again, this idea is repeated so that Priestley shows us that upper class people weren't judging based on merit. They were judging based on class, and that was the issue that Priestley had here. The inspector then says rather slowly, no, she didn't exactly go on the streets. Sheila has now entered and says gaily, what's this about the streets? So gaily, she's happy. She's incredibly happy here. And actually, this is where there's a lot of tension because you'll notice that the moods are very contrasting. There's a lot of tension because Sheila's coming in thinking that she is going to walk in, find out some of the gossip and then be able to go. And that's not what's going to happen. So there's a lot of tension here. We sort of worry what's going to happen to Sheila. What's this about the streets? Noticing the inspector. Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Mummy sent me in to ask you why you didn't come along to the drawing room. We shall be along in a minute now, just finishing. Again, the inspector should be the one saying that, but it's actually Birling. Sorry, hay fever. Where was I? And the inspector says, I'm afraid not. Now, this is Mr. Birling trying to push for the power from the inspector, and this is the inspector clawing that power back. So, Birling then says abruptly, so look at that adverb, so he's being quite rude with the inspector now. There's nothing else, you know. I've just told you that. Sheila, what's this all about? Nothing to do with you, Sheila, run along.